The world ended with a whimper, not a bang. At least, that's how it sounded from inside my hole in the ground. The last radio transmission was a static-laced plea for order that dissolved into hymns, then silence. The last human voice I heard, 3 weeks ago, was my neighbor Mr. Henderson screaming as his dog tore out his throat before turning on his wife. I'd watch from my attic window, a shotgun trembling in my hands that I couldn't bring myself to fire. I wasn't a fighter. I was a gardener, a history teacher who knew how civilizations fell. So I did the only thing that made sense in my historian's brain. I went back to the earth. My name is Silas. My shelter wasn't a bunker. It was a dugout, a hobbit hole, painstakingly carved into the side of a wooded hill on my 5-acre property. I'd been prepping it as a quirky root cellar, a pandemic project that became a prophecy. When the chaos reached our rural county, I moved in for good. The first month was excavation. Pure, backbreaking labor that left no room for panic. I'd chosen a spot with gentle southern slope, shielded by a dense thicket of blackberry brambles and young oaks. With a shovel, a pickaxe, and a desperate focus, I dug. The design was simple. A narrow, downward slanting tunnel 6 feet long, leading to a single chamber 8 feet wide, 7 feet deep. I shored up the walls and ceiling with salvaged lumber from my shed, creating a rib cage of 2x4s against the earth. The ceiling was a thatch of more lumber, a heavy plastic tarp, 2 feet of packed dirt, and finally, a layer of transplanted sod and forest debris. From 3 feet away, it was invisible. The entrance was the masterpiece. A heavy, homemade timber door, sheathed in corrugated metal from my old barn roof, set at a 45-degree angle at the tunnel's mouth. I covered it with a cascading curtain of sod and vines held in a wooden frame. A door sod that blended perfectly with the hillside. From the outside, it was a bump in the terrain. From the inside, it was a barricade. I moved my life underground. A camping cot, a small wood-burning stove from a defunct hunting cabin. Its stovepipe snaking up through a cleverly disguised tree root chimney made of stacked clay pipes packed with gravel for filtration. A hand-cranked radio, a dozen battery-powered LEDs, a shelf of books, and my most precious cargo, seeds. Heirloom seeds for potatoes, beans, squash, carrots. My larder was cans from my pantry, sacks of rice and beans, and jars of everything I canned from last year's garden. The first night I sealed myself in, the silence was absolute, not peaceful, consuming. The earthy smell of damp soil and pine roots was my new air. The only sound were the pop of the stove and the frantic drum of my own heart. I was a mole person, a ghost in the ground. I learned the rhythms of my new world. Dawn and dusk were for the surface world. Quick, terrified trips to a nearby creek with collapsible water carriers, concealed by a ghillie suit of burlap and leaves. I dug a small, hidden latrine pit far from the creek. I set snares for rabbits. I became a student of the wind, learning which direction carried the moans. The shamblers, a bland, accurate name, did come. I heard them first, a chorus of wet, groaning sighs moving through the woods like a foul breeze. I'd huddle in my hole, the door barred, barely breathing. They'd pass within yards, stumbling over roots, but they never found the door. Their world was flat, visual, immediate. My world was buried. My greatest enemy wasn't the dead, but the damp. The earth wept. Condensation beaded on the ceiling planking and dripped constantly, a maddening, irregular tattoo. My blankets grew mildew. My books warped. I fought it with a dehumidifier bucket of calcium chloride I'd stocked, and by keeping the stove burning to drive out the chill. It was a constant, losing battle. One afternoon, 6 weeks in, the battle changed. A sound at the door, not the random scrape of a passing shambler. A deliberate thump, then another, a focused pounding. My blood turned to ice. Someone or something was trying to get in. I grabbed my hatchet, the only real weapon I had, and stood in the center of my chamber, facing the door. The pounding continued. A voice, muffled by earth and wood, slurred but intelligible. "Hello, someone help." Human. Alive. Every instinct screamed to stay silent. My historian's mind whispered of Trojan horses, of desperate men who would kill for a dry hole in the ground. The pounding became weaker. Please. I stood there, paralyzed by fear and a morality I thought I buried with the old world. The pounding stopped. A soft, sliding sound. Then silence. I waited an hour before unbarring the door, and peeking through a tiny, concealed peephole I drilled, a man lay slumped against the hillside, 10 feet from my door. He was gaunt, bleeding from a gash on his leg, shivering. A backpack lay beside him. He wasn't moving. I had a choice. Bring a stranger into my sanctuary, or let the woods, or the shamblers claim him. I looked at my shelf of seeds, at my stove, at my fragile, damp piece. I barred the door again, sat on my cot, and put my head in my hands. I had built a shelter to survive. In that moment, I realized I'd also built a tomb for my own humanity. The cozy dugout felt suddenly terribly cold. The hollow in the hill wasn't just in the earth. It was inside me. And as I listened to the silence where the pounding had been, I knew the first winter of the new world would be the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. The image of the man slumped against my hill played behind my eyes every time I closed them. At first light, armed with hatchet and knife, I crept out. He was gone. Only a dark stain on the moss and a single, empty protein bar wrapper remained. He'd either crawled away or been taken. I felt ashamed, so deep it felt like a physical sickness. I scrubbed the stain away with leaves and dirt. That shame hardened into a new rule, carved into a support beam. And oh, one comes in. The dugout was my secret, my burden alone. To share it was to risk it. To risk it was to die. Autumn deepened, and with it came the true test of my shelter. The rain. A 3-day deluge turned my world into a waterlogged nightmare. The tunnel entrance became a muddy sluice. Water found its way in, seeping through minute cracks in the door seal, trickling down the tunnel floor. My main chamber became a damp cave. I spent hours digging a small drainage sump in one corner, lining it with gravel. The damp brought cold, a deep, bone-aching chill that the little stove fought valiantly but couldn't conquer. I was constantly either too close to the fire, sweating, or too far away, shivering. My clothes never dried completely. They took on the permanent, sour smell of wood smoke and wet earth. My routines became sacraments. Morning, check the peephole. Stoke the stove. Pour yesterday's condensed water from the dehumidifier bucket into my filter. Record the date and weather in my journal. A pointless act that felt like sanity. Afternoon. If the coast was clear, the grueling, silent crawl to the creek for water or to check my rabbit snares. I ate one hot meal a day, usually a thin stew of beans, a handful of rice, and if I was lucky, a few cubes of rabbit. The rest was cold rations. I was losing weight, my body consuming itself. The darkness was psychological. The LED lights pushed back the black, but they couldn't fill the space. The earth pressed in from all sides. I started talking to the roots that poked through my ceiling. I named them. Frederick the Fir was the thickest. I read my books aloud, just to hear a voice, even if it was my own. I reread Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you'll find strength. The words felt like a lie spoken into a well. My first major mistake happened in late fall. A snare caught a fat snowshoe hare. Elated, I made a reckless decision to build a small, hidden smoking fire outside to preserve the meat. I chose a spot downwind, built a tiny teepee of greenwood, and got a smolder going. The smell of smoke and roasting meat was intoxicating. I didn't see the shambler until it was 30 feet away. It was a hunter, or had been, still clad in torn orange vest. It wasn't shambling. Its head was up, nostrils flaring, moving directly toward the smoke. It had smelled me. Panic. I doused the fire with my precious water, grabbed the half-smoked hare, and ran for my door, my ghillie suit snagging on branches. The thing let out a guttural moan and changed course, following the sound of my flight. I dove through the bramble curtain, scrambled into the tunnel, and barred the door just as a weight thudded against it. It was outside, pounding, not like the sick man. This was mindless, persistent thumping. It moaned incessantly, a horrible, rasping sound just feet from my head. It stayed for 2 days. I sat in the dark, my stove coal to hide the smoke, eating cold beans, listening to my own heartbeat compete with a monster at my gate. On the 3rd morning, the sound stopped. It had wandered off. The lesson was brutal. Smell and sound were vectors. My shelter was visually hidden, but I was not a ghost. I was a scent, a vibration, a flicker of heat in a cold world. From then on, no outdoor fires. All cooking inside. Smoke diffused through the gravel chimney. No unnecessary noise. I became a phantom. The first snow fell silently, blanketing my door sod. It was a blessing and a curse. It hid my entrance perfectly, but it also meant water collection became the agony of melting snow of a stove, a fuel-intensive process. The world outside turned monochrome and deadly quiet. The shamblers were still there. I saw their tracks in the snow, circling aimlessly, but they were slower, stiffened by the cold. On the winter solstice, the shortest day, I hit my lowest point. The damp, the dark, the silence, the grinding monotony of survival. It coalesced into a crushing despair. What was the point? To live like a terrified badger in a hole, waiting to die? I looked at my hatchet, a dark thought whispering. Then my hand brushed the burlap sack of seed packets. I pulled it out. Kentucky Wonder Beans. Detroit Dark Red Beets. Provider Peas. Names of abundance, of life. I'd been planning for a spring garden I wasn't sure I'd live to see. Planning required hope. I couldn't live just to not die. I needed to live for something. The seeds were that something. A contract with the future. I spent that long night planning not just survival, but cultivation, where I'd clear a hidden plot, how I'd irrigate from a creek. A purpose, however fragile, was born in the damp and the dark. Winter had me in its teeth, but I was no longer just waiting for the cold to end. I was waiting for the ground to thaw. The historian in me knew civilizations aren't built on hiding. They're built on planting. And Silas the mole would plant. The thaw was a season of mud and revelation. Snow melted to reveal a world scrubbed clean, but profoundly empty. My creek swelled with icy runoff. The shamblers were active again, leaving deep, sucking footprints in the soft ground. And I, with my seed packets and a desperate need for purpose, began my most dangerous project yet, the garden. The spot was a small, natural clearing 60 yards from my dugout, shielded on 3 sides by thick laurel and access through a tunnel of blackberries I carefully maintained. It got 5 hours of direct sun. Enough. Clearing it was a test of nerve and patience. Every scrape of my shovel, every crack of root felt like a broadcast of the dead world. I worked in 20-minute bursts, then would stop and listen for a full 5, heart-hammering. I couldn't turn the soil openly. Instead, I practiced no-dig gardening I'd read about. I laid down a thick layer of cardboard I'd saved from my old life, then hauled buckets of leaf mold and rotted wood from deep in the forest to build raised, lasagna-like layers. It was backbreaking, slow work, but it was quiet, and it felt like creation, not just defense. I planted my seeds with the reverence of a priest conducting a sacrament. Each tiny, dried husk held a rebellion against the decay above. Potatoes went into a separate, hilly patch. I surrounded the clearing with a low, loose fence of brush, not to keep anything out, but to make it look like natural debris from a distance. Watering was the real risk. I needed to bring water from the creek, in plain view, every other day. I fashioned a yoke from a broken branch to carry 2 buckets at once, and did my hauling in the gray light of pre-dawn, when the shamblers seemed least alert. Every trip was a silent, terrified pilgrimage. One such dawn, I saw the dog, a German shepherd, emaciated, ribs showing like barrel staves, standing at the tree line across the creek. It watched me, head low, ears forward, a survivor. My heart leapt. Another living thing. Then immediately clenched. A dog could bark. A dog could attract every shambler for a mile. A dog could be dangerous. Our eyes met across the water. It didn't growl. It didn't approach. After a long minute, it turned and melted into the woods. I saw it twice more that spring, always at a distance, always silent. We were two ghosts, acknowledging each other's presence but bound by the same rule of silence. I started leaving the guts of any rabbit. I snared on a flat rock near the creek. They were always gone the next day. The garden became my reason to leave the hole. Tending the sprouts, first fragile green spears of onion, then the broad leaves of squash, was an act of profound therapy. I talked to them. I apologized for the poor soil. I celebrated every new leaf. My dugout was a tomb for my past self. The garden was a cradle for a future one. Then the rain returned. A warm, torrential spring rain that fell for a week. My tunnel flooded again, an inch of muddy water covering the floor. My precious books on the bottom shelf were ruined, pages bloated and fused. I wept as I threw Meditations and a waterlogged history of Rome onto the stove to dry, watching Marcus Aurelius curl and blacken. It felt like burning the last of the old world. But above, the garden drank. It exploded with growth. The beans climbed the brush pile. The potato plants grew lush. It was working. The near disaster came on a day I was harvesting early lettuce. I was crouched in the garden, my back to the woods, focused on the leaves. A change in the air, a stillness, made me freeze. I slowly turned. A shambler stood at the edge of my brush fence, not 10 feet away. It was a teenage boy wearing the tattered remnants of a basketball jersey. It wasn't looking at me. It was staring blankly at the vibrant green of the potato plants, a color I hadn't seen in a long time. It took a shuffling step forward, its foot crushing a young bean shoot. My hatchet was 3 feet away, leaning against a stump. I was unarmed. I stopped breathing. The thing moaned softly, a confused sound. It took another step, now inside my garden, trampling the onions. A low growl cut through the quiet. From the laurel thicket, the German shepherd emerged. It was between me and the shambler, its body rigid, lips pulled back over yellow teeth. It wasn't looking at me. It was focused entirely on the dead thing in the garden. The shambler turned its head toward the sound, a fresh moan bubbling in its throat. The dog charged, not with a bark, but with silent, terrifying ferocity. It leapt, sinking its teeth into the shambler's calf and pulling it off balance. They went down in a tangle of limbs and growls and moans. The shambler flailed, grasping at the dog, but the shepherd was a whirlwind of focused violence, tearing at its neck. I didn't stay to watch. I grabbed my hatchet and my basket of lettuce and fled, not to my dugout. I couldn't lead anything there, but to a secondary hide, a hollow log I'd scouted. I hid, listening to the wet, terrible sounds until they stopped. An hour later, I crept back. The shambler lay motionless, its head a ruin. The dog was gone, only a few bloody paw prints in the mud, led back into the deep woods. The garden was partially trampled, but most of it was saved by a wild dog, a silent ally. That night, in my dugout, eating the salvaged lettuce, I realized the landscape of my survival had changed. It wasn't just me against the dead. There was a dog, a silent guardian of the green things. There was a garden, a promise I had to keep. My world had grown just a little beyond the walls of earth. The silent spring had given me not just food, but a fragile, strange community, and a debt to a wolf in shepherd's clothing that I had no idea how to repay. Summer was a fevered dream of green and gold. My garden, nourished by spring rains and my terrified devotion, became a jungle of productivity. Squash vines ran amok, their yellow blossoms becoming fat, striped fruits. Bean pods hung thick and heavy. Potato plants flowered, promising buried treasure. For the first time since the fall, I had abundance. It was terrifying. Harvesting was a logistical nightmare. I couldn't possibly eat everything fresh. Preservation was now my paramount task, and every method carried risk. Canning required sustained, high heat from my stove. More fuel, more smoke. Drying required time and exposure. I worked in the sweltering heat of my dugout, the stove blazing, rendering my sanctuary into a sauna. I filled jars with pickled beans, stewed squash, and jars of precious, plain water from the creek, sterilized for storage. The work was constant, mind-numbing, and absolutely vital. It was the burden of bounty. My shelves, once lined with books, now held the gleaming, hopeful glass of home-canned goods. My history was now one of recipes and pH levels, ensuring my botulism-free future. The dog, whom I'd started calling Sentinel in my head, became a regular, if distant, presence. I increased my offerings: rabbit carcasses, fish I'd managed to take from the creek, even some of the gristly bits from a young deer I'd lucked into with a well-placed snare. I'd leave them on the flat rock. They'd always be gone by morning. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of him watching me from the woods, his golden eyes unreadable. We had a pact, sealed in silence and meat. My greatest summer challenge was water. The creek slowed to a trickle. My filtering and boiling process used more fuel. I began to dig. Behind my garden, in a low, damp spot, I started a secret seep hole, a crude well. It took days of digging before I hit a consistent, muddy groundwater. I lined it with stones and let it settle. It wasn't creek clear, but it was water that didn't acquire a dangerous, exposed hull. Another thread in my safety net. The heat also brought a new horror: flies. Swarms of them, drawn by the general decay of the world, and, I feared, the scent of my garden and my own waste pit. They found their way into the dugout, a buzzing, persistent plague. I fashioned a fly strip from pine sap and hung it, catching dozens in its sticky grip. Their buzzing became part of the summer soundtrack, a maddening counterpoint to the moans from the woods. One afternoon, while checking my well, I found footprints. Not mine, not Sentinel's. Human, boot prints, size large, in the soft mud at the creek's edge where I usually fill my buckets. They were fresh from that morning. Panic, cold and slick, washed over me. Someone else was here. Someone alive, capable, and close. The prints led from the creek into the woods on the opposite side of my property, the direction of the old Johnson farm. This changed everything. A person was an infinite variable. They could be a fellow survivor, a kindred spirit, or they could be a desperate scavenger, a predator who'd kill for my jars of squash, my safe hole, my life. The story of the man at my door in autumn haunted me. Had I turned away a potential ally? Was this his revenge? I became a prisoner again, not of the dead, but of the living. I curtailed all activity. No garden visits during daylight. I only went to the creek under the cover of a moonless night, moving like a shadow. I watched the Johnson farm direction obsessively from hidden vantage points. A week later, I saw smoke. A thin, careful column rising from the Johnson's chimney. They had a fire going. They were settled. They were confident. My dugout, once my cozy refuge, now felt like a trap. Its location was my deepest secret. If they found it, I started sleeping with my hatchet in my hand. The burden of bounty was now compounded by the burden of paranoia. My harvest was no longer just food. It was a prize, a beacon for anyone with eyes to see a thriving garden in a dead world. I had to make a decision. Approach them, risk contact, or hide forever, hoping they'd never stumble upon my clearing. The answer came from Sentinel. 2 days after I saw the smoke, I went to the rock at dawn to leave his usual portion of a rabbit. The meat from the previous day was still there, untouched. A first. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I found him 100 yards into the woods, lying in a bed of ferns. He was alive, but a deep, gashing wound ran across his haunch. Not a shambler bite, but a clean, sharp cut, from an axe or a large knife. He lifted his head as I approached, a weak growl rumbling in his chest, but he didn't have the strength to rise. Someone had hurt my silent ally. Someone from the Johnson farm. The message was clear. This wasn't a territory of shared survival. This was a territory of conflict. They'd encountered Sentinel, seen him as a threat or prey, and attacked. They were hostile. Any thought of peaceful contact evaporated. I was at war. A cold, silent war for my plot of earth, my water, my life. I looked at Sentinel, panting in pain. He'd saved my garden. He'd, in his way, saved me. I couldn't leave him. The man who barred his door to a human now had to make a choice about a dog. Gritting my teeth, I tore a strip from my shirt. I had a tiny stash of alcohol wipes and antibiotic ointment from my first aid kit. "This is going to hurt," I whispered, My first word spoken aloud to him. He watched me, his eyes wary but resigned, as I cleaned and dressed a wound. He flinched but didn't snap. When I was done, I left the rest of the rabbit next to him. Stay alive, I murmured and retreated. The burden of bounty was now the burden of war. I had a garden to defend, a dog to protect, and an enemy over the hill. My cozy dugout was now a command bunker, and the historian in me knew no civilization survives without conflict. The summer of plenty was over. The season of siege had begun. Sentinel survived. For 3 days, I left food and a shallow bowl of water from my new well at the edge of ferns. On the 4th morning, he was gone, leaving only paw prints leading deeper into the woods. A part of me ached, but I was relieved. He was mobile. He was back in his world. Our silent partnership had shifted. I was now a vulnerable point for him, and he for me. The presence at the Johnson farm became my obsession. Through my binoculars, scavenged from my old house, I observed. I saw 2 people, a man and a woman. They moved with purpose, not the desperation I'd expected. They had a small, fortified garden of their own. They had tools. They were not just surviving, they were building, and that made them more dangerous. Builders need resources. The first skirmish was over water. My creek, the border between our territories, was now a pathetic stream. I watched from hiding as the man came to fill containers. He looked strong, capable. He scanned the woods not with fear, but with calculation. He saw my garden. I saw him stop, stare at the lush green patch across the water. He didn't cross, but he saw it. The knowledge was now in his mind. A prize. I had to protect my well. It was my new lifeline, and it was closer to my dugout than the creek. If they found it, they'd find me. I spent a night of frantic work, camouflaging the seep hole with a carefully constructed deadfall of brush and logs that looked natural but could be moved quickly from one side. I also set up a simple alarm, a tripwire of fishing line strung between trees at ankle height, connected to a pile of balanced tin cans. It would be a crude, noisy warning. A week of tense quiet passed. Then, one evening just after dusk, the cans clattered. I was at my door in an instant, hatchet in hand, peering through the peephole. It wasn't a shambler. It was a man from a farm. He'd tripped my wire. He stood frozen in the twilight, listening, a large knife in his hand. He was looking directly at my camouflage well cover. My blood ran cold. He'd found it, or he was very close. He didn't approach the well. Instead, he knelt, examining the ground, looking for footprints, looking for signs of the wire setter. He was hunting. He moved toward my garden next. I watched helpless as he pushed through the brush fence. He walked among my plants, not trampling them, but inspecting them. He pulled a ripe tomato, sniffed it, and put it in his pocket. The theft felt like a violation. Then he did something worse. He pulled my largest, most beautiful winter squash on the vine, examined it, and deliberately dropped it on the ground, letting it crack open on a rock. It wasn't theft for hunger. It was a message, a display of dominance. I am here. Your things are mine if I want them. He left after that, melting back into the woods toward his farm. I didn't sleep that night. Rage and fear warred in me. The historian knew this pattern. Border incursions, resource testing, symbolic destruction. It was the prelude to larger conflict. I couldn't fight him head-on. He was bigger, stronger, likely better armed. My strength was secrecy, patience, and the land itself. I decided to fight a guerrilla war. The next day, I began making the territory hostile. Not to kill, but to deter, to confuse, to frighten. I dug shallow, concealed pits lined with sharpened stakes along the most likely approaches to my garden and well. I smeared some of my precious pepper paste on tree bark at hand height, along trails. I created subtle, confusing false trails that led in circles or toward areas where shamblers sometimes congregated. My most psychological weapon was sound. I found an old battery-powered baby monitor in my attic cache. I took the receiver, but left the transmitter unit hidden near my garden, its power on. At random times during the night, I would turn on the receiver in my dugout and whisper static or make soft, wet, chewing sounds into it, then turn it off. Let them wonder what was making noises in the dark, so close to their prize. The war was cold, silent, and exhausting. Every day was spent maintaining my defenses, watching, listening. My gardening suffered. The joy was gone, replaced by the grim work of fortification. The climax came on a night of heavy fog. The cans clattered again, followed by a startled curse and a heavy thud. One of my pit traps. I waited, then crept out, my heart a drum solo. It was the woman. She'd fallen into one of the shallower pits, her leg gashed by a stake. She was struggling to get out, her face pale with pain and fear. She wasn't a warrior. She was a scavenger sent on a raid. I stood over the pit, my hatchet visible. She looked up, saw me and froze, her eyes wide. "Please," she whispered. "Don't. My husband, he's not right. He made me come." "You took my food," I said, my voice gravelly from disuse. "We're starving. Our garden failed. He's scared. Please." I saw the truth in her eyes. They weren't powerful builders. They were desperate, failing survivors. The man's show of strength was a bluff. The cracked squash was an act of spite from a starving man. The historian in me saw the collapse of empires from within. Paranoia, resource scarcity, tyranny. I didn't help her out, but I didn't hurt her either. "Tell your husband this land is protected," I said, layering my voice with a menace I didn't feel. "The next trap is deeper. The next visitor won't leave. Now go." I stepped back and watched her haul herself out, limping badly, before disappearing into fog. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sick. I had become the monster in the woods, the boogeyman protecting his hill. The war of the well wasn't about water. It was about what we were willing to become to keep what was ours. I had won this round by being more frightening, more vicious in my preparation. But as I barred my door against the fog and the moans, I wondered if the man I'd sealed inside a year ago was still in here with me, or if I'd buried him for good under layers of fear and spikes of sharpened wood. The woman didn't return. Neither did her husband. For a month, the Johnson farm was silent. No smoke rose from the chimney. My binoculars showed no movement. Had they left? Had they succumbed to starvation? Or something worse? My traps remained unsprung. The only tracks near my garden were sentinels, who had returned, his limp barely noticeable. He resumed taking his offerings, but kept his distance, his trust in humans perhaps permanently fractured by the gash on his haunch. My garden, neglected during the silent war, needed a desperate harvest. Squashes were overripe, beans tough, potatoes ready to be dug. It was backbreaking work, but it was peaceful. The immediate threat was gone. Yet, the encounter left a poison in me. Regret, not for defending myself, but for the cruelty of my defense. The woman's terrified face haunted me. I processed the harvest in a state of grim automation. Jars were filled. Potatoes were brushed of dirt and stored in burlap in my coolest corner. Beans were strung to dry from the ceiling. My dugout was a cornucopia, a tomb of plenty. I should have felt secure. I felt like a dragon on a horde, lonely and paranoid. The first frost came, silvering the blackberry brambles. It was time to put the garden to bed for winter. As I pulled dead vines and covered beds with leaf mulch, I found myself looking toward the Johnson farm. An impulse, stupid and dangerous, took root. I had to know. I went the next day, moving with all my old caution. I approached from the rear through the old orchard. The place was a ruin, but a recently inhabited one. The door to the root cellar was ajar. I peered inside. Empty, but with the stale smell of human habitation. In the farmhouse, I found the story. They were gone. In the kitchen, a note, weighted by a rock, fluttered on the table. It was in a woman's handwriting. "To whoever finds this, we're trying for the river. Couldn't stay. John's leg got bad after the pit. I'm sorry for the squash. We were just so hungry. God forgive us." John, the husband, his injury from my trap had festered. They'd left, probably to die on the road. I had won my war. I had defended my hill, my beans. And in doing so, I had likely condemned 2 people to death. The weight of it crushed me. I sat on their dusty floor, the note in my hand. I was no better than the dead outside. I was just another predator in a predatory world, my territory marked by spikes and fear. I took nothing from their house. It felt like grave robbing. I left the victory ash in my mouth. Winter closed in with a vengeance, an early, fierce cold that sealed the world in ice. My dugout, for all its flaws, was a haven of steady, if damp, temperature. The hard work of harvest was over. Now came the long, dark introspection. I had time to think. Too much time. I replayed every decision. Letting the sick man die at my door. Maiming the woman. Driving the Johnsons away. Was this survival? Or was I just preserving a hollow, hateful version of myself at any cost? My only solace was my routine and Sentinel. He began to appear more regularly, even venturing to sit outside the bramble curtain on sunny, cold days. I'd open the inner door, and we'd share the space of the tunnel, him in a patch of weak light, me in the shadows. We never touched, but we shared silence. He was a living thing that didn't demand anything from me but food, and didn't judge me for my sins. I started reading again, by LED light, the few books that had survived the damp. I found a tattered copy of the Odyssey. I read of Odysseus, a man trying to get home after a war, who did terrible things to survive. The ancients didn't see him as a pure hero, but as a complex, flawed man shaped by a brutal world. It was a small comfort. One bitter night in deep winter, a sound woke me. Not the wind, a scraping at the door. Not a shambler's random thump. A deliberate, weak scrabbling. Fear, then a weary resolve. I wouldn't make the same mistake. Not again. I unbarred the door, hatchet ready, and pushed it open a crack. It was Sentinel. He was lying in the snow at the entrance, whining softly. A bloody wound, fresh, marred his shoulder. This wasn't a knife cut. It was a jagged tear. A shambler, or maybe a struggle with a wild boar. He looked at me, his eyes clouded with pain, and tried to wag his tail. He had come to me, for help, for sanctuary. All my rules, my hardened heart, shattered. I couldn't turn away a second time. I pushed the door wider. Come on, I whispered. He didn't move. He couldn't. Gritting my teeth, I crawled out into the freezing night, hooked my hands under his chest, and dragged him, all 80 pounds of him, into the tunnel, then into the dugout. I barred the door, my world now containing another living, breathing, bleeding creature. I cleaned his wound by the stove light. It was bad, but not fatal. I used the last of my antiseptic, bandaged him with strips of clean cloth, and made him a bed of old blankets in the corner. He slept. I watched him, the rise and fall of his ribs, the twitch of his paws as he dreamed. The dugout was no longer just my shelter. It was our shelter. The silence was filled with his breath. The dark was held back by the warmth of another body. The harvest, I gathered, wasn't just beans and potatoes. It was a harvest of regret, a bitter crop that had shown me the cost of my isolation. But in pulling that dog from the snow, I had planted a new seed, a seed of responsibility, of connection that wasn't based on trade or fear, but on simple animal need. The winter was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, the hole in the ground felt less like a tomb and a little more like a home. I had survived a year. I had a full larder, a secure shelter, and the scars of my choices. And now I had a dog. It wasn't much, but in the long, cold dark, it was everything. Sentinel's presence changed everything. The dugout, designed for one melancholic human, now housed a convalescing 80-pound canine. Space, already a premium, vanished. His smell, wet dog, blood, and earth mingled with wood smoke and damp, creating a new, lived-in musk. He whined in his sleep, chased dream rabbits with twitching legs, and watched me with those liquid, gold-flecked eyes that held a depth of understanding I hadn't expected from an animal. His recovery was slow. I shared my rations, boiling bone broth from my store venison scraps, and mixing it with mashed potatoes and beans. He ate reluctantly at first, then with a growing vigor that mirrored his healing. I changed his bandages, talking to him in a low, steady monologue about nothing, the weather, the book I was reading, the consistency of the stew. My voice, unused a conversation, felt rusty. His ears twitched in response. The routine expanded. Morning, stoke fire, check Sentinel's wound, make breakfast for two, haul water, now a stealthy, pre-dawn chore with a predator in tow who wanted to follow. Afternoon, read, repair tools, talk to the dog. Evening, cook, tend the fire, listen to the winter winds howl above our earthy roof. His simple needs, food, water, a place to piss, a new complicated issue I solved with a designated potty area just outside the tunnel I cleared snow, gave my days a structure that went beyond mere survival. I was a caretaker again. The psychological thaw was more profound than the physical one. The crushing weight of solitude lifted, replaced by the lighter, different burden of companionship. I wasn't just Silas, the survivor, anymore. I was Silas, who had a dog. It was an identity, a connection. He, in turn, began to guard. If a shambler moaned too close, a low growl would rumble in his chest, a vibration I felt through the earth floor. He'd stand, hackles up between me and the door, a living alarm system far superior to my tin cans. He was no longer just a beneficiary of my shelter. He was part of its defense. The deep winter tested us. A blizzard sealed us in for 4 days. The world above was a roaring white fury. My woodpile, which I thought ample, began to dwindle alarmingly. The temperature in the dugout dropped. Sentinel and I huddled together on my cot for warmth, his body a furnace against my back. I rationed the fire to only cooking and the coldest hours of the night. We lived in a twilight of cold and semi-darkness, our breath pluming in the LED glow. On the 3rd day, disaster struck. A particularly fierce gust down the chimney must have carried embers, or the long, constant use had finally taken its toll. I smelled it first, acrid, not like wood smoke. Then Sentinel whined, pawing at the wall near the stovepipe. A thin tendril of smoke was seeping from between the clay pipe segments where they passed through the wooden ceiling support. The wood around it was smoldering, a glowing, angry orange ember eating into my primary roof beam. Panic, pure and electric. A fire underground was a danger. It was a death sentence. It would consume the oxygen, fill the space with toxic smoke, or collapse the roof. I had no water to spare. I acted on instinct. I grabbed a pot of half-frozen dirt from my ill-fated indoor potato experiment and hurled it at the smolder, smacking the muck against the beam. It hissed, and the ember dimmed but didn't die. Sentinel was barking now, a sharp, alarm sound that felt deafening in the confined space. Quiet. I hissed, but the damage was done. His barks echoed up the chimney pipe, a beacon in the silent, stormy world. I frantically stripped off my wool sweater, wrapped it around my hand, and pressed it against the hot wood, smothering the last of the ember. The smell of burnt wool and charred oak filled the air. I stood there, panting, my heart trying to escape my ribs, listening. From above, through the howl of the wind, came an answering sound. Not the wind, a moan, then another, drawn by the bark, by the unusual smoke perhaps. Shamblers were gathering above my burning roof. Sentinel fell silent, sensing the new threat. We were trapped, sealed in by snow, with the dead converging overhead and a compromised roof beam. We waited in terrified silence for hours as the moans circled and eventually faded with the storm. The immediate crisis had passed, but the structural one remained. The main support beam was charred, weakened. I spent the next day rigging a makeshift support, a forked branch jammed from floor to ceiling next to it. It was ugly, and it stole precious inches from my living space, but it held. The fire in the hole had been literal and metaphorical. It had shown me the fragility of my sanctuary. A single ember could end it all, and it had shown me the risk of my new companionship. Sentinel could betray our position with a sound. But as I looked at him, curled protectively around my feet as I worked on support, I knew I wouldn't trade him for the silence. The fire had burned away the last of my selfish isolation. This hole was ours now. Its perils were shared. Its peace, however fragile, was shared too. The storm broke. Weak sunlight filtered through the snow-packed door sod. When I dared to peek out, the world was a pristine, white blank canvas. marred only by the shuffling, frozen tracks of the dead who had stood guard over us. We had survived the fire. We had survived the storm. Together, as I melted snow for water, Sentinel limped out to do his business, sniffing the strange, clean air. He looked back at me, his tail giving a single, slow wag before he got to work. He was home, and so, for the first time in over a year, was I. The cozy dugout was no longer just a shelter from the outbreak. It was a place where two survivors, one human, one canine, had decided to keep each other alive, and that made all the difference. The snows melted, revealing a world both familiar and forever changed. My second spring in the earth. Sentinel's wound was a pink, hairless scar, and he moved with most of his old fluid grace, though he favored the leg on cold mornings. Our bond was wordless but absolute. He followed me on my dawn water runs, a silent, gray shadow scanning the woods with senses far sharper than mine. I never had to train him to be quiet. Our survival depended on it, and he understood. The garden was a mess of dead foliage and winter-killed weeds, but beneath the mulch, life stirred. This year, the planting felt different. It wasn't a desperate grasp at hope. It was a planned investment. Sentinel and I worked the plot together. Me digging, him lying at the edge, ears perked for danger. I talked to him about crop rotation. He listened with polite canine indifference, his nose twitching at the scent of worms. I expanded. Using lessons hard-learned, I dug a second, smaller seep well as a backup. I built a proper, concealed smokehouse out of clay and stone a good distance away, where I could preserve meat without risking my main shelter. My territory was no longer just a hiding place. It was a homestead, a tiny, hidden nod to civilization. The ghosts of the past lingered. I sometimes walked to the Johnson farm, now truly a ruin. Weeds choked their garden. I felt no pride, only a somber acknowledgement. I took a few usable tools they'd left behind. A better hoe, a handsaw. It wasn't looting. It was salvage, a use of resources they no longer needed. I left a jar of my previous year's pickled beans on their table, an apology to the air. One afternoon, while checking my farthest snares, I found something new, not a rabbit, a deer, taken down by what looked like canine teeth, but only partially eaten. Sentinel sniffed it intently, then looked into the deep woods and gave a soft woof. Not a bark of alarm, but one of recognition. A week later, I saw her, a lean, gray wolf, watching us from a rocky outcrop as we returned from the creek. Sentinel stopped, his body tense. He didn't growl. He stared. The wolf stared back. Then, with a flick of her tail, she vanished. Sentinel had family, or the beginnings of a pack. The wild was reasserting itself, and he was a creature balanced between two worlds, the cozy, food-sure world of the dugout and the call of the deep woods. It posed a new, quiet heartbreak. Would he leave when the call grew strong? The thought of the dugout without him was a return to a loneliness I now knew I couldn't bear. I didn't try to chain him. Freedom, I had learned, was the one currency left that had any value. He came and went as he pleased, sometimes disappearing for a full day, but he always returned, often with a gift, a mangled woodchuck left at the tunnel mouth. Our pack remained. The true turning point came on the anniversary of the fall. I marked it not with fear, but with a quiet ritual. I opened my last jar of peaches from the old world, the syrup golden and precious. I shared half with Sentinel, pouring the sweet fruit and juice into his bowl. We ate in silence, the taste of a lost summer on our tongues. After, I sat on the hillside in the sun, my back against my hidden door, Sentinel at my feet. I looked at my hands, callous and scarred, stained with earth. I looked at the thriving garden, the smokehouse, the two wells. I listened to the wind in the pines, a sound that no longer felt like a moan, but like a song. I had done it. I had survived 1 year. Not as a hero, not as a warrior, but as a man who dug a hole and slowly, painfully, learned to live in it. I had made terrible choices. I had been cowardly and cruel. I had also been kind, in small, desperate ways. I had saved a dog, and in doing so, saved a part of my soul. The future was unknown. The shamblers still shambled. Other survivors might come, friendly or hostile. Sentinel might answer the wild's call. My roof might finally give way. But as the sun warmed my face, I realized something. Survival wasn't about the end point. It wasn't about making it. It was about the turning of the seasons, the planting of the next seed, the sharing of a meal, the trust in a pair of golden eyes. It was about continuing. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my pants. Sentinel rose beside me, looking up, waiting for the next task, the next chore, the next day. "Come on, boy," I said, my voice clear in the spring air. "Let's go check the potatoes." I pulled aside the sod door, and we descended together into the earth, into our cozy, damp, safe, complicated, living home. The world above was dead, but below, in the hollow hill, we were alive. And for now, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.